Hello, welcome to this special show. I'm Glenn Isherwood, Citizens Party organiser, and today I'm joined by Kingsley Liu, Citizens Party Senate candidate for New South Wales.
How do you do, Glenn?
Yeah, great. Kingsley, thanks for joining me down here in Melbourne. You've travelled down today, and I wanted you down to introduce you to the population out there who right now are being bombarded with all of this election circus. What we want to do is distill the issues that are, right now the most critical for the survival of our economy, for the prosperity of the country, for families out there. Introduce yourself, Kingsley. What has spurred you on to run in this election?
Well, how I ended up here came about by a number of life events. And one of the things that I did very early in life is once I graduated from university, I headed off overseas because I really had a feeling that it was more than just being in Australia, and because I was a minority in Australia, I felt there's more for me to understand and to become and understand more about myself. So I went over to Canada, and yes, I was overseas for 17 years. I had quite a story over there. I did come back eventually with a family, and I got into stockbroking. I became one of the first members of the Australian Stock Exchange. I set up the first Asian stockbroking firm, and I developed quite a reputation out of that. And it was about another 17 years later, with a law degree, I actually formed a law firm with the former Attorney General called Jeff Shaw. And we called that law firm the People's Solicitors. And that got me very, very engaged with the community because we were running refugee cases, we were running cases, against government to get redress for the average citizen who just was not equipped with money to take on and get justice for themselves. What happened at some point, it was about 7 years ago, I was in front of a local Penrith council, and I was fighting the point or the interest of an Islamic community who are developing prayer hall. And that turned into a bit of a riot there. It had about 30 police. And as a result, I ended up running that case in the Land Environmental Court, which we won. I was invited to join a political party. It was the Greens Party of Australia. And from then, my political journey just got more and more entrenched. I ran about 6 times for that party at local, federal and state elections. I'm now with the Citizens Party. I have the appetite and the interest for what they represent. And so here I am, doing my best to transform ideas and develop a good political platform for citizens of Australia.
Well, Kingsley, being a lawyer, you see the result of the laws made by politicians in the courts, and they're two different theatres, you could say, of the battle. One to find justice, to seek justice. So having seen, the burden of fighting these battles, tell us about some of the cases where you had to take on the government in prior to your political in your journey in politics.
Well, all of these cases used up more than just my own resources. It used up a lot of friendships and brought into play the greater network we needed to do to get equality. Remember, we're fighting against government money, their legal teams and top-end barristers. So there's 2 cases that come to mind that were very powerful events for me. One was the Christmas Island boat tragedy event. It's about refugees. Of course, it's one of Citizens Party's policies about refugees and their human rights. That case was about how the government didn't take enough care when refugees coming on rickety old boats were crossing the seas. There were people dying in the process that either didn't make it to the shores or somehow they weren't saved in time. And that was our case, that we felt that the government was not there in time to save the refugees, and there was 50 people that died on the shores of Christmas Island, which is Australian territory. We ran that case into an appeal, and we could have taken it to the High Court. It just that by that stage that the judgment and the decisions that were made by the by the courts made it almost impossible for us to take any further.
One of the things you mentioned about that case to me, Kingsley, was that the government, the contention was the government had knowledge of this boat and the fact that it sunk, could have intervened sooner to save those 50 lives, but it didn't. So there was a case of negligence on the government's part. Is that correct?
Yes. The evidence that we found that from the time the boat was discovered until the government rescue boats arrived, it was about an hour. Those rescue boats, which they call the rigid hull inflatable boats, could have got there in less than 15 minutes from where they were. They had knowledge that that these people were there, and within that whole process of communications, we felt that the government clearly could have done something, and it was because there were systemic failures, and partly I think it's because of the attitudes that prevailed in government about stopping the boats had led to this particular demise.
So a case where the policy of government was such that because of the stopping the boats, the punitive, the indefinite detention policies, we let people die that we could have saved, and you took that to the court, but couldn't get an outcome because it became cost prohibitive. Went to the High Court.
Yeah.
What was the other case that was you wanted to mention?
The other case is an example of when you go to court and how long it takes to actually to get some level of justice and an outcome. And that was it's a Cooler home-based case, which we are currently in the process at the moment. We should be finishing this case and getting a decision quite soon. But it was where a whole group, a whole class of elderly residents had bought into a retirement village. The operators somehow, as being part of the company which operated the village, they were taking excessive amounts of money out. We couldn't find out why and how they were taking the money out, so we had to take it to court, and we pulled out the truth of this matter. There was a series of breaches that one shouldn't normally do if you're retirement village operators, and so we've taken them to task over that. It should be quite a well-known case by the time the decision gets through, because we covered almost every aspect of the law in the process.
Well done. So, looking at this election, what was, why not stay just in the lawyer field? What is it about yourself that compels you to be a candidate?
I think a lot of it had to do with my mum, who was an advocate of her time. She didn't quite finish, she only got to intermediate level, she wanted to be a doctor. Somehow she installed some sort of program in me, which is really hard to fix up. And also, when I reach for the stop button, there's no stop button. So I have a systemic problem within my whole personality makeup. So I have to enjoy life the way it's been set out for me.
and that is to take action, and which is, Citizens Party motto is citizens taking responsibility. So I fair say that's an embodiment of that. Always finding ways to improve the world. So what are your priorities if elected? What are your 3 top concerns that you want to address in this election?
When I talk to citizens and when I talk to the community through my legal practice and the sort of advocacy I do out there in the community, there's a couple of areas that come out quite clearly at what we call at a basic human level. One is people need stability, they need security, and they're worried about their cost of living, their economic value within a very complicated community. But the things that come out for me is that we need pathways of reform, and it occurs at government level and at legislative level to improve a couple of things. And I think there's a couple of mechanisms that can really sort that out, and there's 2 areas. One is internal, and that's the way we structure our economic system. And the banking system is clearly the basic lever to do that with. So when we have a policy that can reform the banking system to engineer a focus more back to our nation building and for people's benefits, then we've got a reform that's going in the right direction. The other thing is external, is how we deal with our neighbours. Because the world has got so much smaller and there's so much arrangements and treaties that we have between countries, it's terribly clear that we need to keep updating that, not exist in the old 18th century model where we were part of the empire, the Greater British Empire, and now we're part of another empire, let's say the Five Eyes Empire. We need to think very clearly about our foreign policy and our defence. They're highly related.
For those who don't know, Kingsley, the Five Eyes is the intelligence sharing alliance of Canada, the United States, New Zealand, Australia and Great Britain. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, and that's led to the Quad, which is Australia, India, and USA. And Japan.
Yes.
Sorry, that's a Quad there. And the other one is the AUKUS agreement, which is between UK, USA, and Australia. Mm-hmm. So they're highly influential, more recent developments, which clearly has projected Australia into a spotlight of a higher risk, and most people feel that that's a high risk. It's not. The advantages of that are not clear at all.
Mm. Well, as Paul Keating made the point, are we looking for security from Asia or within Asia? The alliances that we are currently striking are reminiscent of looking for our security from the Western Hemisphere, from our colonial allies, Britain, rather than seeking stronger relationships in Asia with our closest neighbours. Yeah. And on this channel you'll see two interviews that we've done with former diplomat John Lander on the subject, who has also addressed some of your events up there in Sydney. We'll get to foreign policy in a moment. I want to, and we'll run through your comments on the party policy platform and how we're getting that message out. I want to say though, as a person who's represented with your law firm the Australian community with Asian heritage, what are the unique challenges today, and what is the attitudes from the Asian community with regards to politics?
Okay. I guess being a minority is it is two aspects. One, it leads to a slight complication because of, I guess, my cultural and my racial background. But yet, on the other hand, the other aspect is that we have a very strong desire to integrate and stay integrated with the society so that we are seen as one in Australian society. So having said that, as a politician, an aspiring politician, that complication comes in as that are we wanting to be part of society does almost, in another way, it versus what we think are a natural form of human rights when we seek to have our diversity included in the process. So there's those little internal things that occur to me when I'm facing the public, as a public figure, that I have these two things in mind. So so what happens when I'm with multicultural people, they will resonate with the feelings that come out of me about diversity and all of that, and feeling the need that it's really important that we show our contributions. But from the other point of view, that when I'm dealing with mainstream Australians, is that desire to continuously and show our loyalty and our desire to be integrated and be really part of the community, to be counted in like a fair go mate system, that we are a mate on equal terms. So-
Well, I think gets to the heart of the problem right now with this election. You've got Dutton, you've got Morrison, as we call it, the car key election. They're talking up the danger of war. Dutton actually declaring that China is our enemy. We have to prepare for war with China. And we've seen this destruction of our relationship going on for many years, and part of that is this suspicion led by people like Clive Hamilton's book, suggesting that upwards of 30% of Chinese Australians are more loyal to Beijing than Australia. What that's doing is creating this incredible tension in McCarthyism. Do you see that in Sydney?
Yes, at street level, and I had a very good friend of mine, she's a reporter of the South China Morning Post, she copped it on public transport and sort of like, no, why should you be here? Why don't you just go back? She reported that, and that was in the press in the last couple of days. So it happens to anyone there, and she's a very eloquent, well-spoken lady, and in spite of her trying to deal with it, she still clobbered it because the other person just could not get over the fact that this is an enemy probably sitting in front of her. But having said that, whilst we have these street racism, the authority for all of that stuff on the street where people are just coming out with stuff because they've seen so much narrative there that are negative towards a minority group in Australia, is that a lot of this stems from the policies that the government is running at the moment. They're creating policies on the run, whether it's a khaki election or they are trying to boost their alliances with overseas groups like USA and UK. But ultimately, the basis for all of this, from where it all springboards from, is in our legislation and our law. So what we produce in Parliament and at law stays with us until we change those laws. And it's not just at marginalising a community, and we call it this institutional bias or marginalisation of key parts of the community. It also acts in marginalising other disadvantaged parts of the community, which I'll cover later on.
Well, on this subject, it's been all over the media. Can you say a few words of your observations and thoughts with regards China and the Solomon Islands? This is foreign policy. We're getting a lot in the media about this. What are your thoughts regarding Solomon Islands?
The Solomon Islands is a particularly interesting example of both our foreign policy and our defence all wrapped in one. And you could almost overlay the same template of what we're doing in relationship to Taiwan and in the rest of the world. But if we look at Solomon Islands, let's look at the scenarios. You get two islanders. One island is the headquarters of the current government. You have a competitive opposition party on another island. Remember, those islands in the Pacific have been very tribal in the history of these islands, and it has been there from day one. What we have is a very influential an impressive entity, China, who spent quite a lot of time and effort to go and help its neighbours. It started off in Asia and it's built its way across into the Middle East and certainly in Africa. So that sort of goodwill has been developed by them providing Belt Road Initiative type support in terms of creating infrastructure. Now, infrastructure is almost like, it's exactly what money should buy. And we're talking about ports, airports, seaports, airports, rail, power stations, manufacturing industries, national manufacturing industries and agriculture. Now, when you get support from that by any neighbour, you're going to create trade and investment relationships, which are very powerful. China has been doing that. And what's happened, you have Solomons, which is part of micro-Indonesia. We've got four entities there. We've got Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands and Fiji. They all have essentially in place Belt Road Initiative type arrangements, whether it's formal or not. In New Guinea, where Australia had been looking after Papua New Guinea in a colonial era up to very recently, they had never put any. It seems like they haven't really put much money into New Guinea. Well, the Stanley Owen Ranges now has a highway running across New Guinea, which will open up the entire New Guinea. And that money was put in place with Chinese loans to help New Guinea develop that. That will make a huge difference to their cost of living, to their economy, and their future of New Guinea. When one does that, it is no wonder Vanuatu, Fiji, and Solomon Islands have followed suit. And that's a foreign policy that in action that China's doing. Now, Australia has not done that. We've gone out with gunboat diplomacy.
Well, yeah, Kingsley, I mean, I've often made this point. China has stepped into a vacuum where there's over 150 nations around the world who have made agreements or have some degree of agreement with the Belt and Road Initiative, and China is happy to support that infrastructure development. I always ask, well, where were the Western offers for this? Where was the International Monetary Fund? Where was the World Bank? If we in the West have been so much better, why didn't these 150 countries take up an agreement with the IMF and the World Bank? The problem is we've seen what IMF and World Bank conditionalities have done to countries. There are countless examples of nations, South America, Central America, where they would take up a loan and it was effectively paid out multiple times over, but the interest, they were still paying interest decades later, well beyond the principal of what that initial amount of money was. So it became usury on nations. And, you know, there's books like John Perkins' Confessions of an Economic Hitman, where they confess, well, he said they went out with the intention of being predators on nations that were seeking developmental funds. So China is stepping into a vacuum left behind by a broken and failed international financial system. So Solomon Islands taking this approach. What would you say about Morrison and Dutton's response? What comments do you have about their reaction?
Yeah, well, their basis for these comments is very worrisome. What we have in Solomon Islands, 80% of their economy is imports and exports both ways out of China over the 80% mark. Australia just doesn't have that sort of trade and investment relationship. There's a security pact from Australia to support the Solomon Islands, and yet the Solomon Islands did a parallel security pact with China. There's got to be reasons for this, and I think Solomon Islands as a sovereign nation has decided to opt for balance. And I think that is very much entirely their right. And if they would have only moved in the direction of getting benefits from it, and any contract that they've signed, I'm sure they would have vetted that very thoroughly. So, but going back to what we call gunboat diplomacy, you could almost see that there's threats of regime change. There are threats of US either sanctions or blockades that might be possible with the Solomon Islands, because this Solomon Islands is part of micro-Indonesia. It's probably one of four. I think that if they're trying to dish out a lesson, it's a very poor way to do it. What Morrison Dutton should be doing is reviewing their foreign policy in order to ensure that they've got a more healthier relationship with Solomon Islands. Instead of using the stick approach, they ought to be using the carrot approach. They can go back, they can create infrastructure in the Solomon Islands, they can create goodwill, they can create friendship, and they can help support the Solomon Islands develop its economy and its nationhood.
And I think that's where the neglect is. and John Lander echoes those same points. We seem to be operating as an authority, as an extension of the United States in this area and alienating our closest neighbours. So diplomacy critical. Now coming to domestic policies here, Kingsley, I want to run through discussing banking and finance, housing, infrastructure, defence and foreign policy. We've sort of kind of knocked that one out so far, but there will be a bit more to say on it, and just general economic observations. If anyone would like more information on Kingsley's story, go to our candidates profile page. Website is up on screen, citizensparty.org.au/election22. If you'd like to support Kingsley's campaign and our general campaigns around the country, get in touch. Call us on 1800 636 432 and we'll put you in touch with our candidates wherever you are in Australia. So let's jump into discussing the policy platform of the Citizens Party. Kingsley, banking and finance.
Well, a national postal bank. We've got an infrastructure in place to create a national public bank, run through the post office infrastructure, which is mapped out right through Australia and in particular in the regional areas. Now, a national postal bank will make up the shortfall in a couple of areas. One, it will get access to cash into the regional areas. It'll also restore a direct banking service in the regional areas rather than trying to force people online and go to more regional centres and cities to do the banking. So they're winding down the so-called presence of branches out there in the country and in the regional areas. And I think the other thing is that the agricultural and the regional development areas they need to be connected directly with the people, and that's the presence of a postal bank, national bank, public banking operation will ensure that connectivity is still there. That's where I see it.
Yeah, and the thought of a post office bank terrifies the big four. We saw this. John Dawson, we interviewed him. He was the former director of the ANZ Bank. He said when they saw this in New Zealand, they were all watching it like a hawk. They were very worried about it. In Australia, we saw what happened to Christine Holgate, yet another casualty of the Morrison government. She was forcibly removed on this false slanderous attack, and she dared to put in place preparation for this very idea, a post office bank. Even Michael West identified back in 2018 that the banks are going to fight it tooth and nail. So that is our core policy, is to create a public bank using the infrastructure in place to take on this big four power, the big four bank power. Speaking of which, what comments on the banking system today? What are the problems with our bank model or the lay of the land in banking?
Yeah. The four commercial banks are actually regulated by APRA. They should be directly regulated by Parliament and have mechanisms in place to ensure that the governance of these banks is correctly installed. The mantra of the four major political banks is to commercialise in market rates all activities that they deal with the public. There are essential parts of the public, however, that can be dealt with by a public national bank. And that public national bank can be looking at it in certainly a commercial way. However, if you're dealing with agriculture, you're looking at seasonal differences. We're looking at different market prices. There's a different way of managing those types of loans. Also with small businesses, they are startups. They need to get through the curve so they can get up to a certain revenue break-even point. That's where I think a national public bank could come in and cater for those particular areas. Otherwise, if you've got an equal playing field, you're on the same playing field as the big corporates. You'll get monstered on the way. So that's where I think a national public bank can help restore that parity between the parts of our society and business and individuals where they have get what they are entitled to, have a fair go at that end.
On APRA, I feel you've identified a problem here. The government doesn't take a strong enough role in regulating the private banks, but also APRA has created this perversion where the big four banks have an over-concentration of their loan book in mortgages, 60%. Now, 30 years ago, it was well under 30. It was closer to 25% of all their loan book. So we've created this problem where, as you just said, small businesses can't get in. They can't get started. And that's, absolutely catastrophic for the economy, the diversity.
Yeah. Well, my comment on that, the commercial banks will look at profit and risk as a way of measuring where they're putting their money. Them, it's much more easy to put it into the housing market, getting that supported by the government, perhaps with negative gearing policies and other sorts of subsidies, so that they've got what we call a secure profit development base. However, the more other risk area which is to do with infrastructure, which is generally much lower and takes longer to fruition to get to maturity, to get a yield from that. Commercial banks can't cater for that because they can't go through the early curve of when a business develops and supporting agriculture and regional activities. The commercial banks don't support that. So what we have is a very skewered system to a market which I think it's fragile. We're looking at a bubble type economy, and when you have a bubble type economy versus what we call nation build economies, you will have very contrary sorts of objectives. And then, of course, with the commercial banks, they are exposed to the international money market. They're not be able to control interest rates, as we know that there's a distinct relationship with exchange rates and interest rates, where the drive for interest rates will always move to that of the international interest rate. So we cannot control it. If it goes up in America, if it goes up in Europe, it will go up in Australia, and vice versa, could go down the same way.
So Kingsley, that brings me to, on the subject of housing, you have a proposal on addressing the housing crisis. Now this week, John Howard said he didn't believe there was any crisis in housing, and he dismissed it, saying cost of living has always been an issue in every election. So what are your thoughts on the current state of housing, and how do we address the question of a crisis in housing?
Yeah, poor John. He has a damaged belief system, and he's sitting on a broken record. He should feel the pain, like everyone else should. But going back to housing, we need to look at the statistics. 60% are homeowners, the other 40% are not. They're renters, and there's about 2% of that which are getting public social housing. So we have a very inequitable system, and it's been getting worse and worse. And and with the prices going up, that we have the so-called the debt servicing ratios, the people's ability to get negative gearing and entrench their position as home owners and getting second and third properties. So we only have about 30% of the Australian public that own their house outright. And I think that's a good thing. It should be extended for the rest of the population. So I lived in Singapore for 4 years, and I had an uncle that founded the Housing Development Board in Singapore. He died recently, but I got access to his old office and a lot of his friends up there in Singapore. But the Singapore housing model is a really interesting one. So consider it this way. Government acquires public land and builds, particularly in urban areas, flats. These flats have 99-year leases. It puts a roof over your head. You lease it, but it's a lease and buy situation. And you can tap your superannuation. Now, Singapore has a very strong superannuation system, but in Australia will get stronger, like the Singapore, where you got the employer and the employee matching money. In Singapore, it goes up to 25%, but only up to about $5,000 limit. So it actually, what that does, that pools money into the Central Provident Fund, where a Singaporean resident can access for deposit and for mortgage payments. That public housing market fills that gap of the so-called 40%, or let's say 35-40% of Australians that don't own a house. So that need is there as an option. If we use the Singapore model, you create that as an option for people, if they want to get into a sort of it's a housing scheme where they actually will own their house.
Kingsley, on this, it strikes me as both major parties have no interest in rocking the boat. The issue of public housing, affordable housing, is probably one of the biggest covering Australians, because we have it drilled into us culturally that unless you own your own home or you've got a mortgage, somehow you've failed in life. It's drilled into us. I think that's probably a legacy of Menzies, who went to war on the public housing program of Ben Chifley and John Curtin after World War II. Now, it's, for many people out there, we'll be publishing more on this history. The height of the public housing building program in Australia was post-war, where the federal government, through Chifley, made sure that these massive targets were reached. I think at one point there was 100,000 public dwellings built, and then in Menzies' times they were allowed to be sold to become private dwelling. But we've seen that absolutely collapse, to the point now we're spending, I think, $5 billion a year on rental assistance for the private rental market. So that's again reinforcing what you just described about landlords getting money effectively from the government via distressed tenants. So what are your thoughts on how much of a target are we painting on our backs if we go after this?
Okay. How would this solve the problem? Okay, the first thing is if you create what they call a private public housing scheme run by the government, the first thing it does is alleviate the runaway prices in the property market. You won't need to subsidise people with homeowner grants and all of that to assist them. You are actually able to provide a stockpile of housing into the market to control entry of housing into the market. Now, whether it's 99-year leases or 100% owned with a Commonwealth Bank loan, whatever, it's still providing housing is housing, and that you're able to control your housing prices. The government needs to have the will to go back in, and I think the will should be there if you see the disaster that our housing market has become. As I say, 40% of Australians, how many of them, we need to ask, want to own their own housing? I think if you did a referendum on that, you'll find out really fast that it's probably most of people want to do that. And the most important thing is there is a perception that if we can, okay, the issue is that there are supposed to be a store of value, but the other second one, it should be affordable. So if you do a public housing model very similar to let's say the concept of Singapore, you don't have to do it exactly the same, then you'll be able to cover those two areas of concern or opportunity. So it was disbanded and returned into a private housing market. Now it's time to reverse that. You do that, you will solve the housing problem. And it will create jobs. You can create them as national projects because the government will be owner of these housing in a way as because of their long-term leases. So in a way, you're creating national infrastructure in housing. It goes along with nation building, and you can create industry for that.
And if you do that, there's going to be a lot of demand for infrastructure. And as we know with infrastructure, it's going to open up new income streams, absolutely. Speaking of which, next policy discussion is on infrastructure. Now we've worked with engineers over the last many decades on some bold, big projects. Thoughts on national development and infrastructure?
Yeah, national development infrastructure, as you know, all our infrastructure leads to more economic activity, more jobs, more industry, education, skills training. And there are big projects out there like the Iron Boomerang, where you're creating a steel industry in Queensland by bringing iron ore across Australia. But remember, just like I say with the Stanley Owen Ranges Highway, you're opening up the country. So the north of Australia is an amazing area for development. It's closer to Asia, and a lot of the resources are up there. Mm-hmm. So then you've got high-speed rail network. That can be done. I think the current cost should be around about 90 billion. You could create a high-speed rail network from Brisbane through to Melbourne and across to Adelaide. And that will connect up most of the population and build regional centres, like in Goulburn, Albury. They'll be key areas that one would develop as regional cities. So that's really important. That creates economy. Mm-hmm. Then you've got the rest. You've got NBN, that's an infrastructure. You still got roads to develop. But as I said, the key thing is to open up the undeveloped parts of Australia and have just develop agriculture, manufacturing, and service areas, and that helps distribute the wealth and the actual active working part of our nation is distributed regionally. It's an important thing.
And supply chain will be a function of that. Defence of Australia, defence policy and foreign policy. We touched on Solomon Islands, China relations. What would you advocate for in Parliament when it came to the question of defence?
I have a specific idea, which I have discussed with a number of people, and so far there's been support for it, but it's not very well known. But the idea is with our defence, we are drawn into it because of our allies to look at supporting and being part of long-range offensive military infrastructure that they can run and we are part of. We get trained in using their weaponry. Their weaponry is supplied to us. So we're actually merged into their military forces. And a lot of it is long-range offensive military strategy.
And that in the lingo is interoperability. So it's a big term, often gets thrown around by politicians, the interoperability with the United States, yeah.
So the way forward is a fairly bold way. And the reason why we do that is actually financial. We're spending about 2% of our GDP on defence. Now, if we were bold enough, we should double that, maybe 4 or 5% of our budget to put into defence. Now, what that would do was we would do that on one hand, but we boost our defence capability to more short-term deterrent defence policy. Our military spending and our armed forces would be geared very much like Switzerland, that anyone gets too close will blow them out of the skies. So we don't have to have long-range offensive policies. We can keep it very much short-range. And we can include in that defence policy those that want to work with us within, let's say, a 1,500 mile radius from Australia. And so that can include Micro-Indonesia and parts of the Pacific. Now, that's an inclusive defence policy that works with others. On the other hand, we can use our National Infrastructure Bank to actually develop industry. And we can produce a number of those shorter range missiles, javelins. Sorry, I don't have all the name. You can help me with that. You may know some of them. To have a localised defence manufacturing industry, and we can produce for USA and UK, and we maintain a stockpile, a minimum stockpile, and we have the option to keep that for our defence needs first.
So you're saying we don't purchase all of our defence from the military-industrial complex and the United States arms manufacturers. You're suggesting that we actually produce our own and maintain our own defence from a sovereign capability.
Yeah, we'll become a new Switzerland, and they've done very well out of it. And well, we'll have to make a profit out of it, and that's just a fact of life.
Well, I think it does say, I mean, Robert Barwick, Senate candidate here in Victoria, made the point the other day that the best defence any nation can ever hope for is a skilled, well-trained and maintained manufacturing sector. You know, when asked in what part of the United States that the Germans and the Japanese wanted to bomb first on mainland of the United States, it was always the Rust Belt. It was always Michigan, Detroit, these areas, because that was the arsenal of democracy, as they called it. And, you know, this is where, you know, the precedent that we always talk about was what Essington Lewis did, the Munitions Board in Australia did with under Curtin and Chifley in pretty much very short time frame, getting Australia prepared with the manufacturing of planes and bullets from 43 to 45 was extraordinary. So, do you want to say anything on that? Or?
Yeah, the interesting thing is about in a weapons industry, there's a great deal of transferability of skills, particularly in manufacturing, because there's a higher component of electronics, IT software. There's a lot more integration of various components, and all of these can be done in Australia. And Singapore does it very effectively as well. So it is an industry, but it's highly transferable. What is good for the goose is good for the gander. We can usually use exactly those same systems for other areas of nation building infrastructure.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, Kingsley, that covers the main areas I wanted to cover today, and conscious of not making this too long, but just on the general outlook of the economy and this campaign, what's your advice for Australians, and how can they help further get you into the Senate?
Well, I think it's really important that we as individuals develop our own vision for Australia, and we share that vision, and together, and if I can become a senator this time around, let's bring in the concrete and bring that to Parliament and build a foundation for our future vision. We need to have a vision and be very clear about it, because that's the only way we can really move forward as citizens.
Kingsley, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today. Jump on the website, get in touch, and vote one Citizens Party at this coming election.
Thank you. Thank you, Glenn.
Cheers.
Authorised by Craig Isherwood, Citizens Party, Melbourne.